Hello and welcome to today's edition of the IT Collab podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Nathan Taylor. Brandon Barnes is not able to join us today. He's out of the office today, so I'm flying solo. But I'm excited to be joined by my friend Jim Hinsey from Portrium. We've had the privilege of being on some panels together through Philem's MSS network. And I just appreciate Jim's perspective on things. So I thought we'd get you on the podcast and talk through some top of mind topics. So how you doing today, Jim?
I'm excellent. Thank you for asking.
Good deal. Well, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us about your background and what you're doing these days.
Yeah, so I've been in IT and around IT for about 34 years now.
Okay.
Started as a developer and then moved into security right around 2000 and been doing security work. I started in FedRAMP right around 2012. Was with a CSP from about 2014 to 2019, working on FedRAMP. It was a data center, so we had every compliance issue that you might want to deal with, IRS, SOC, ISO, PCI. So data centers are that way. They have a lot of people in them. And then I moved into the assessment realm, 220, and been doing assessment. And then just recently, in the last couple of years, I've been doing CMMC.
Awesome. And that's definitely a topic I'd like to dig into. It's interesting to hear kind of your journey there, right? I'm curious, do you think it's common that a lot of the assessors have a long set of experience? I feel like that's one of the things you need to be in that assessor role, right? You kind of are building on all the things you've done over the years.
Yeah, I think for the senior assessors and the technical project managers that are doing assessment, you definitely need to have background. My FedRAMP background was 6 years with a cloud service provider, and then I'm almost coming up on 5-6 years as an assessor.
Okay.
But I think you're right. But we do have junior assessors and we do have senior assessors.
Yeah, and that's certainly how like the CMMC board is set up. It's set up with, senior assessors and junior assessors because you got to have that person who's kind of the last it ends with him. He's in charge. It's his fault. So explain to me what FedRAMP is, just for our listeners who are not familiar with that, because that's a term I think will come up a couple times.
So FedRAMP's a program that's been around for a while. I think 2012, maybe 2010. And FedRAMP was built so that an agency or a federal agency could come and get an assessment, a security impact assessment on a cloud service provider software. So that cloud service provider would go through, do a full security assessment based upon the NIST 853 requirements. And we would go through and assess them. And then the idea was that would be a federal ramp for other agencies not to do a repeat of that assessment. I think prior to FedRAMP, there was a lot of agencies were doing their own assessments. We approve this software. No, we don't approve this software. And so FedRAMP was created to try to not only keep the cost down from a federal agency, but then to try to consolidate, assessments for the software over. So a single agency that did the assessment, then another agency could come and use that without having to feel like they had to go through another security assessment.
Okay.
So that's FedRAMP. It's been a very successful program. The cloud service providers like AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, of course, name a few. They took on a big lead in about 2014, 2015, and they're doing a really great job keeping up on all of the security requirements that are required by the NIST 853 Rev 5. And then right around 2016, CMMC started to gain steam, And this was because of the supply chain vulnerabilities and threats that were happening. Um, it, it seemed like the supply chain was being reverse engineered, and that was, I think, giving everyone concern, especially in the DoD world and the DIB companies.
Yeah.
It was a really funny thing is I think in 2016 or 2017, my boss approached me and said, "Hey, do you want to get into CMMC?" And I said, "Oh, it's not going anywhere." And then about 4 years later, here we are, and it's just now getting through
Yes.
all of the approvals, and uh, CMMC requirements are now being embedded within the DoD contracts for supply
Yeah.
chain. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually based on your numbers. It's 8 years later before it actually got legs. So it's just crazy. So I'm gonna go hit on a couple things you mentioned because as you're throwing out a lot of terms, and I'm just gonna define a couple of them. So FedRAMP is a way for government organizations to be able to say, I can use this solution without having to worry. It's already been vetted as being safe for government use, and that has a lot to do with, do foreign nationals have access to the code or the infrastructure, those sort of things? Is the code safe? Those sort of infrastructure, and like with Microsoft or Google or AWS, you're in a data center that has only U.S. employees that's kind of vetted to their standards on all their security standards. You can run things in that data center, and the data center itself is FedRAMP certified and is cleared for government use. Is that a fair assessment?
FedRAMP authorized, so it's kind of just a little tweak there. But you're right on the path. It's an authorization that they've gone through a security assessment, and they passed that security assessment.
Okay. And then you mentioned CMMC. So let's talk about where CMMC came up, because it's a topic I'd like to keep digging into on the podcast, because it's an area of interest of mine. I have approximate knowledge of pieces of that. The CMMC originally kind of is a second generation of the 800-171 rules. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is correct. It is a direct pull from the NIST 800-171, and then the CMMC put a couple of their flavors on some of the items. It's really interesting because in FedRAMP, if there's a control implementation, and you can risk rate if the cloud service provider, is not meeting the security requirement, you can say, oh, this is a low risk or this is a high risk. In CMMC, you don't have that. You're either met or not met. So it's really cut and dry. And that's something that I think people need to know, because when it comes to a control implementation and you're not met, that could just sink your entire assessment.
Yeah, no question. So as you mentioned, the CMMC framework was originally built on the 800-171, and that was produced because there was this concern that, the federal government's got this top secret plan. Let's make an example for a fighter jet, right? And so they've designed this fighter jet, and they're working with Boeing, and Boeing's building the fighter jet. But Boeing needs 5,000 suppliers to supply parts for this fighter jet, right? Somebody's building rivets, somebody else is building bolts, somebody else is building frame components, and somebody else builds wheels. All of those parts then have a security associated to them. They may not be themselves top secret content. They were, as the world would call it in the CMMC world, they're controlled unclassified information, CUI. And the federal government identified that most of these small manufacturing companies building these parts, this DIB, as you called it, the Defense Industrial Base, all these people who supply the federal government, the DoD, the Department of Defense, just didn't have the security controls in place. And so the early attempt was 800-171, and the idea was that all these small and medium businesses would comply with these federal requirements to be secure, and it didn't happen at all, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And so let me provide a couple of defining points. The difference between 853 and 171. 853 applies directly to the federal organizations, where 800-171 refers to non-federal networks or DIB networks. And then let me take that one step further. The difference between CMMC and the NIST 800-171 is that their CMMC added this certification program to
Yes.
the 800-171. So that's really, those are some key differences, because people are like, well, I can do a 800-171 gap. But if you're not going through the certification program for CMMC, right, that doesn't really meet your federal contract
Right.
requirement.
Right. And so CMMC is a non-federal org. It's almost a nonprofit organization that everybody got into, that's funded and staffed by federal org people, but also non-federal, really employed more industry people who said, these security regulations are not taking effect. Nobody's following them. So CMMC, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program, was designed to say, hey, defense industrial base, people who provide things to the government, we're now going to enforce this. We're going to build a process. It's not the standard that was needed. We have the security controls in 171, although they needed some tweaking, but it's more focused on, can we actually make these partners follow these rules and protect this data? And that's where CMMC came out, 7-8 years ago, it got invented. And then it became years of wrangling about what the rule looks like, right? As you mentioned, it's a very strict set of policies. There's not a lot of, hey, I'm going to fix this later. It's pass or fail, and it's pretty strong to get your certification when you get audited, when you go through that certification audit.
Yeah, so that's correct. Yeah, so you're right on point there. It is a certification program, and there is a nonprofit organization, the Cyber AB. And the Cyber AB is the program. It's not affiliated with DoD, but it is a nonprofit organization that is helping to mature the CMMC ecosystem. And so their whole charter, I guess, is to, help individuals and companies, achieve this certification program. And there's in that ecosystem, of course, you have assessors and professionals and advisor, and then you have the CAICO, who is dealing with the certification of individuals,
right?
And then you have the P3PAOs that are dealing with the certification of the actual non-federal network DIB companies.
Yes. So then this CMMC standard comes out, and then it's taken 8 years for it to get codified to the point that it actually has some teeth. A lot of that happened even in the last couple of months. In July, I think there was a big ruling. A lot of that's going to start hitting. What's interesting in our world is, what is it going to take to get these defense industrial base small and medium businesses to actually engage on that? And what is the teeth behind CMMC? Why is it actually starting to take effect and people are noticing it this year and especially next year?
Yeah, so the proposed rule has made it all the way up to Congress, and this is the last step. Congress has to review it and then give their stamp of approval. The DoD it's gone through a couple of different checks. The one that you mentioned in July is that the DoD had finalized the rulemaking and sent it forward to the Office of OIMB, I think, and they actually approved it and moved it on to Congress. I'm not sure if it's OIAB or OEB. I'll have to look that up. But there was one more step, and then it got certified. So at this point, the DoD is now looking at contracts that are starting in October 2024 for fiscal year 2025. And they're now starting to embed the CMMC requirement within those contracts to say, hey, in order for you to have this contract be awarded, you have to meet the CMMC level 2 certification.
And that's where the teeth finally come, is you can't take any money from the federal government on these contracts unless you are certified. That's really what's going to drive the behavior change.
Yep,
is the money,
that's
the
correct.
dollars. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I think some companies were thinking they could do a self-assessment, and
Uh-huh.
the thing that you don't get in the self-assessment is that the actual certification, and that's the big thing that the DoD wants. And the way that the DoD is embedding the CMMC requirements, it is that it is embedded in the contract, and then of course all the DIB companies bid on the contract, and it's not going to be awarded to any companies that are not CMMC um, assessed.
Certified. Hmm. And I'm hearing that a lot of the primes, the bigger contractors, the Boeings, Lockheed Martins of the world, are already pushing their suppliers and saying, "Hey, we know this is coming, so we're going to enforce this as soon as possible. You need to get this figured out." And so that downward pressure has already started. Of those primes know that if they don't have subcontractors who can pass, they're in trouble because they won't be able to get parts for the contracts they're awarded. Um, but there's some big challenges, and there's a lot of angles I'd love to chat with you on this. Um, but how many, how many people are actually have gone through the certification process and passed? Is that happening, and how is that going for people who are early adopters and are trying to be ahead of that curve? Do you have a
Yeah,
feel for that?
so I do have a feel. I think the larger corporations are doing it. I think there's my last review of all of the DIB companies. There were like 58,000 something DIB companies, and I would say a good portion of them have done some sort of self-assessment or gap analysis. Um, but when it comes to the actual moving past the self-assessment into the certification, that has not happened, right? So there's not, and that's because the final rulemaking is the right there's this catch 22 where the final rulemaking has to say that companies can we grant the capability for companies to be certified, and then so the DoD though is I think is moving forward and saying we know it's going to get approved, so we're going to start embedding all of the stuff, all the CMMC requirements and contracts. And so maybe as soon as December, right, you'll start to see push into, hey, where's your CMMC certification program? Or did you do a self-assessment? So companies can do a self-assessment, and they can, they can do that for data not critical to national security, or non-prioritized acquisition. That data is not critical. All good. But once the data is critical to national security, then they do need the actual certification program. And then let me touch back on the ESPs or the MSPs or the service providers
Yes.
to the prime contractors. So it does state that in the CMMC rulemaking that if a prime is using ESPs, subcontractors, either for IT or for whatever, and they're also processing some sort of CUI, FCI data, that the subcontractor has to be certified prior to the prime being certified for that contract. So what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of people bidding on contracts, especially the primes, and then they're going to be going to the small primes. Hey, are you certified? And if you're certified, then of course maybe they'll consider you as an ESP. And if you're not certified, then I think this is a barrier for entry for companies that aren't getting certified.
Yeah, I
Because
think. Go ahead.
yeah, no, I was going to just I was going to continue to say, because if you're not certified, that means the prime will not be certified and they won't be awarded the contract. So
Yes.
it's a real barrier.
So we're hitting this perfect storm because, as you talked about, with I've heard numbers as high as 300,000 businesses in America are going to need to be CMMC certified. And we could talk through some examples I've already seen in my travels, but 300,000 small businesses, but also those 300,000 small businesses all have IT providers, and those IT providers have to be certified as well, depending on who you ask and how it's cut, because some of this stuff is still being evaluated. But there's some pretty clear issues of whoever your MSP, your IT provider is, depending on how they're interacting with your systems, there's some really big concerns on whether they're CMMC certified. This is all hitting in a context of, hey, contracts are going to require this certification. Nobody can certify yet, and there's not going to be enough assessors. So we're going to hit early 2025 that all these companies are not ready for this assessment. There's not enough assessors, and all the contracts are tied to this. And their IT providers have to be out of decertified. So it's this incredible perfect storm of layers coming into our industry in the next 12 months.
Yes, I agree. So let me give you some stats here. I did some stats for our leaders based off the Cyber AB town hall that they had on Tuesday. Currently, there are 57 C3PAOs. Those will be the people that will be going through the assessment certification program.
Certified third-party assessment organizations.
Yeah, certified third-party assessment organization. In FedRAMP, they're called 3PAOs, and CMMC, they're called C3PAOs. There are currently 285 certified assessors. So that's currently the total number of CCAs in the ecosystem today.
So they all have 100,000. They all have 1,000 customers each to go assess. It'll be easy.
Yeah. So I pulled something off the web that fiscal year 2023 of an account of all of the DIB companies. And in that particular spreadsheet, it had 58,873 DIB companies. So of course, what do? I take the 58,873 and divide it by the 285, right? And these are just the primes and the known ESPs with those primes. It doesn't include like if an ESP is using, an IT outsource, or like the ESP is, they do all the CAD drawings, but they outsource the actual part delivery to someone else. I know, like for example, I know on some of the aircraft, right? A lot of the screws and the nuts and stuff, they get outsourced to smaller companies.
Yes.
And so, it becomes a question now, does that really mean they have to fall under that? But if you divide the 285 into the 58,000, that's 206 assessments per CCA, which is a lot. I think from our TPM perspective, we probably can get a dozen, maybe a couple. If you're really good and they're small, you could probably get, a good 15 to 20 done in a year. Normally,
so you're talking one assessment a month per assessor is a realistic number. Wow.
Then that's kind of optimistic. I think that's an optimistic number. I think, it's more like 8 to 12, 9 to 12. Of course, some of these can overlap and stuff like that. But
sure. I also think from what I've heard, it's optimistic to think that of those 9 to 12, half of them might even pass. Like, I just think the assessments are going to be so hard that at that slow rate, that there's not going to be many people who make it through the assessment. You're going to have to fail a lot of people at that rate anyways.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting that you bring that up, because within the 800-171, what CMMC has done is they've given a ranking to some of the control objectives. So they'll say, oh, this control objective is a 5, this control objective is a 3, and this control objective is a 1. Well, if you get any 5s or 3s, you're going to be not met. So it's really important for smaller companies to get out there and look at, the CMMC requirements and say, okay, what are the 5s? What are the 3s? These are our high priorities to work first. And a lot of people don't realize that. So, for example, if you have a CMMC, a CUI enclave, for example, and you have and you put together a architecture diagram and a software security plan associated with that. You have CUI data already, and say you don't upkeep that, and now you're coming to certification. Well, guess what? One of those 3 or 5 items is your SSP up to date, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if they say no, right, you failed the
You failed.
entire session.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I need to write a little white paper on, hey, these are the CMMC gotchas.
I think it's a great idea because I think it's something like it's a learning curve, right? I've been trying to kind of learn it as a side interest because it's not core to what I do in my day-to-day work, but I see how it's going to impact our industry. And it's a learning curve. It takes a lot of thinking and understanding of new ways to approach it. And one of those things I want to chat with you about is approaches to passing, because I've gotten a lot of customers who have come to us in the service space and said, "Hey, I'm a defense industrial based company, and let's use an example we've seen multiple times. I'm a 200-person machine shop. I'm in some rural part of central United States. I'm in Colorado or Nebraska, and we build parts. We machine aluminum. We got 75 CNC machines, 200 employees, and we build parts for tractors and parts for fighter jets. That's what we do." And they come to us, and sometimes they'll ask really interesting questions in the interview process of finding a service provider, because they'll come and say, "Hey, I need you to move my entire company to Office 365 GCC. I got to get into the Gov Cloud of Microsoft 365. And you learn to go, why? And they go, "Well, I'm going to be under CMMC, so we're going to move our whole business into this Gov Cloud, and we'll be better off." And I know a number of people in the space who say that's a really, really bad approach, because it's very difficult to get a traditional business to just convert their entire business model into a CMMC compliant technology environment, because there's too many gotchas. There's applications in the system or users in the system or details in the system that you're just going to have a lot of trouble fitting into a CMMC compliant set of policies and procedures. So most of the people I know who are really digging into this are doing what's called an enclave and trying to take that data and say it's a subset of users at a separate computer system, maybe even a separate IT provider that run the enclave. Is that how you're seeing things go? A lot of companies going into an enclave sort of model? Or
well, yeah,
what are you seeing?
I would say the general advisory type recommendation is to, hey, create your CMMC enclave or your CUI FCI enclaves. I think that's a common architecture, and there's nothing wrong with using Microsoft
Sure.
Gov Cloud, especially if all you're dealing it with are contracts, and
Right.
From a contract perspective. But it does, you're right, when the rubber hits the road, maybe you have a CAD drawing. Certainly that CAD drawing could live in Microsoft GCC and be protected, and you have the role-based access control around it, all of those things that you need in 800.171. But then, when you go to implement that onto the machines that are, creating the parts, now all of a sudden, you have to look at, okay, my CMMC enclave is here. So scoping is very important.
Yes.
And there are some scoping guides that the government has put out, the DoD has put out. And so I will send you a link to here's a good scoping document. Fortrim also put together how to account for your inventory. What is your CMMC CUI inventory? What's your FCI inventory? We do see a lot of companies coming and saying, "Hey, we really want to do this," and we'll say, "Okay, where does your CUI live? Where does your FCI live?"
Yes.
And they can tell us. So I put together a document on, inventory management for CMMC, and I'll send you a link to that as well,
Okay.
and you guys can send that out to your podcast.
Beautiful. I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because I look at the CIS controls, which are not tied to any federal regulation. It's just a general CIS top 18 security framework. It's a security approach. And one of the reasons I really like it as an approach for our industry, for the small business IT industry, small medium business, is it's very approachable. And what it does is it breaks down this complex IT problem of security into steps. And the first three steps are just your inventory. What is
Yeah.
your devices? What are your users? What are your applications? And what are your data? If you don't have those four questions answered, you can have the most advanced security plan in the world. But if it's not covering one component of those things, hey, it's got 70% of my data and 40% of my users, that security system is worthless because it's not seeing, you haven't scoped it properly. And
Yeah.
I think, like you said, that idea of scoping and even understanding what controlled classified information, CUI, or federal contract information, FCI, you have, which I agree with you. I would guess that many DIB companies don't know what they have and don't realize where it is and how they need to rein it in and kind of put it. So even if they could build an enclave with a provider who's got that figured out, hey, I built this enclave for you, they don't know what needs to go in there and they don't know if they've gotten it all, right? So it's a very
Yeah.
challenging
So
problem.
it is. And I think like, people think, oh, I've got it up on SharePoint and we're using the Office 365 GCC SharePoint. So, we put our FCI and our CUI, data up there. We're fine. And I'm like, okay, well, where is it? What exact folder is it? Who has access to that folder?
Yeah,
And sometimes they say, well, we're only 30 people. And I'm like, well, yeah, but that means that everybody has access,
right,
right?
right.
Well, if everybody's clear, then I'm like, okay, come on. Using these generics to try to say that, hey, we're going to specifically meet the control objective just really doesn't work.
No,
So
and it's subtle because it's like, hey, well, I understand you have it in that SharePoint spot, but that SharePoint site's accessible from your employee's grandma's computer, right? You don't have the security controls around access, or your IT provider has full access to that folder. Your SharePoint backup solution is accessing that folder. Is that SharePoint backup stored in a FedRAMP solution that's approved, right? Like you start unwrapping the onion, and there's layers and layers here to solve.
yeah, it really is. And, SharePoint was built for flexibility. It was,
Right?
we want to give the capability for everybody to share things,
Yeah,
SharePoint. So that's really interesting, but you're right. There's this big, I think, not only with the inventory, but the misconception of where it's kept and, what do I have? So asset management is really, it really is. It's going to be a lot easier for the smaller mom and pop companies. It's usually a lot harder for the larger companies.
yeah.
Uh, you really need a team of people running around, trying to classify everything.
Yeah, it's challenging. I think it's going to be wild to see how the industry responds. Anecdotally, I've heard some interesting customers come to us. One was, like I said, a machine shop, and they wanted to move their entire operation to federal cloud. And you're like, hold on, slow down. You need an enclave, and don't move your users, all of them, to Gov Cloud. You don't need that for your day-to-day users. You need it for the enclave, right? And kind of trying to educate is part of the challenge.
Yeah.
Um, but then I talked to a reseller, and he literally resells off-the-shelf airplane parts. He goes, hey, these are all listed on this website. Anybody can see them. The contracts I'm bidding on are publicly accessible contracts. So I'm selling off-the-shelf parts for a publicly accessible contract to a DoD provider, but I cannot take any money unless I'm CMMC certified. So even the CUI in this case is publicly accessible. It's not, not sensitive data, but the contract is tied to,
Yeah.
I'll be in a second, buddy, is tied to this. So he has to build a tightly scoped agreement around his CUI and has to get CMMC certified, probably in a very, very tight and limited enclave, but he still has to do the process because he can't make any money on the government unless he's doing this. So it's wild.
Yeah, no, it's a good first step. Um, you know, there is no one, there's not going to be a one solution fit all, right? It really is going to be uh, how your environment is built, what you're doing, you know, what are the machines that you have? What are the, are you using, pad machines and CNNC machines that are actually doing the parts themselves?
Yeah.
Is the specification on that machine, most than likely, yeah. So scoping is really important, and always undertake a really good inventory management and then a good scoping uh, exercise before you try to get busy and trying to go for certification.
Awesome. I mean, I'm glad there's people like you. I know a number of other people in the space who are really working hard to say, hey, let's solve this problem. Um, so you said are you on the CMMC advisory board, the CMMC AB, or are you?
No, I'm not on the advisory board. I'm just heading up. I'm helping Fortrium get into the CMMC space
Got it.
for CMMC. So Fortrium, of course, is a C3PO, so they get paid for assessments, but we
Yes.
also do the advisory work. So, but I do attend. I do attend most of the Cyber AB town halls and try to take as much as I can and
Hmm.
move it along.
There's some good orgs popping up. I don't know if you're aware of the MSP Cyber X. That's an org I saw that's very much focused on CMMC education. So I think there's lots of groups trying to pull together best practices. And so, Jim, I
Yep.
appreciate you kind of letting me pick your brain. I would love to have a follow-up conversation in a couple months and just, I feel like this is one of those things you're going to have a different story to tell in a month or two of how things have evolved as the rubber really hits the road on these regulations. And so I appreciate your time, and hopefully we can have you back.
Anytime, Nathan. It was really good, and we'll get out and let people know, and spread the word, uh, help them out when they need help. But certainly, don't hesitate if you have questions, because I'm always here.
I'm sure we'll run into you again on one of Philem's MSS network events. He's doing those all the time, and those are fun. So thank you for your time
Thank you very much.
today, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
thanks.